My mother once warned me that your mate doesn't arrive like a prince. He arrives like a storm that will tear your world apart. I didn't understand her until I saw a lone wolf on his knees, surrounded by enemies, yet looking like the only king in the room. And in the space of a single thunderous heartbeat, I felt the first drop of rain. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The weight of the silver tray was a familiar ache in my bones, a cold reminder of my place. It was a beautiful thing, this life in the Silver Moon Pack, if you were on the right side of it. From my side, the one spent polishing this very silver until my knuckles were raw, it was just a cage. A really pretty cage, filled with wolves who wore their power like a second skin and their cruelty like a jewel. The air tonight was thick with the scent of pine from the ceremonial wreaths and something else, a sharp electric hum of anticipation that promised nothing good for a girl like me. Tonight was the moon ceremony. Moving through the great hall was like wading through a river of silk and whispers. I kept my eyes down, my spine curved into a bow of submission because that was the only armor I owned. A flash of crimson silk cut across my path. Alara, the beta's daughter, of course. She didn't even look at me as her shoulder clipped mine, hard enough to make the crystal goblets on my tray sing a nervous little song. No apology, no acknowledgement. I was just part of the scenery, less important than the tapestries hanging on the wall. They at least had a story. I was just a ghost with a disgraced name. My mother's face flickered in my mind, her eyes sad. Kindness is its own kind of strength, Lyra, even when they call it weakness. But her kindness hadn't saved her, had it? It hadn't stopped them from whispering about her blood, about the forbidden magic they said ran through our veins like a poison. What good was a strength no one could see? A strength that only earned you scorn and a lifetime of serving people who believed you were less than the dirt on their boots. It was a lie I had started to believe myself. What if they were right? The Alpha's voice boomed, silencing the chatter. I froze near a stone pillar, melting into its shadow. He spoke of alliances, of unity, of the strength of the pack under the full moon's gaze. His words were smooth stones, polished and perfect, but they skipped right over the ugly truths churning beneath the surface. He spoke of loyalty, yet his own beta's daughter treated me like refuse. He praised strength, but the only strength I saw rewarded was the kind used to push others down. The whole ceremony felt like a performance, and I was just a stagehand in a play I hated. Tonight, the gathering would welcome wolves from a dozen other packs, each one a mountain of muscle and arrogance. It was a night for forging bonds and for sizing up rivals. For a girl like me, it was just a longer, more dangerous version of every other day. 100 new ways to be invisible, 1,000 new eyes to avoid. My own pack was difficult enough, but outsiders were unpredictable, their rules different, their tempers unknown. Because I was Lyra Hale, I had to be more careful than anyone. The consequences of a single mistake, a spilled drink, a misplaced word, would be swift and brutal for the girl with healer's blood. The thought sent a tremor through my hands, and the goblets shivered in response, their chiming a quiet prophecy of the long night ahead. The ceremony hadn't even truly begun, and already a chilling dread was settling deep in my gut. Chapter 2. Whispers of a Monster. Following that grand announcement, a frantic energy seized the pack. The great hall, already immaculate, was scrubbed and polished until every surface gleamed with a desperate light. It was a frantic dance, and I was swept up in the current, my hands aching from wringing out damp cloths and my nose full of the sharp tang of beeswax. The servants whispered as we worked, our hushed voices a secret river flowing beneath the loud commands of the pack's elite. They weren't whispering about the decorations, though. They were talking about the guests. They were talking about monsters. They say the Alpha King of the Nightbane pack is coming himself, a girl named Elia murmured, her eyes wide as she polished a shield on the wall. Kale Nightbane. Just the name dropped the temperature in the air. I paused, pretending to scrub a stubborn spot on the floor. I had heard the name before, of course. Every wolf had. It was a name used to scare pups into behaving, a name that tasted like blood and fear. I heard he ripped an alpha's throat out with his teeth during a peace negotiation, another boy added, his voice barely a breath, because the man's shadow touched his. The stories were always the same: impossible feats of strength, unthinkable acts of cruelty. They painted a picture of a king who was more beast than man, a creature of pure, untamed instinct who ruled the largest territory on the continent through nothing but sheer terror. He was a legend, a nightmare, and he was coming here. Why would someone like that come to a simple ceremony? What could he possibly want from us? The question hung in the air, unanswered because the truth was too terrifying to consider. A king like that didn't travel for pleasure. He traveled for conquest or for war. It felt so unreal, trying to imagine a creature of such immense power walking these same stone floors. He was a god of war, and I was nothing, a speck of dust. The contrast was so vast it made my head spin. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the circular motion of my rag on the cold stone. Thinking about him was pointless. I would never even be in the same part of the room as a king. I was a Hale, after all. My place was in the shadows, at the edges. Later, the pack's head servant, a stern woman named Anya, confirmed my fate. She found me arranging napkins, her gaze as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. "Lyra," she said, her voice clipped, "you'll be serving the West Corner tonight. The unassigned guests." The West Corner. The words landed like stones in my stomach. It was the furthest spot from the Alpha's high table, a dim, forgotten alcove reserved for loners, Omegas from other packs, and anyone else not important enough to have a designated place. It was the table of outcasts, a public declaration of worthlessness. Of course, it was the perfect place for me. I simply nodded, the familiar burn of shame hot in my cheeks, because there was nothing else to do. I would serve the broken and the forgotten, a fitting job for a girl who was both. As I gathered the cheap pewter goblets for my assigned station, I steeled myself for the long night of humiliation ahead, never imagining that the most broken-looking wolf of all would be the one to change everything. Chapter 3. The Wolf in Tatters. The great hall roared with life. 100 different scents, wolfsbane, roasted meat, sweat, and dominance, clashed in the air, a dizzying perfume of power. Flames from a dozen hearths danced across the laughing faces of wolves draped in velvet and jewels, their voices a thunderous ocean of sound. I moved through it all on silent feet, a ghost in a plain brown tunic, my tray of cheap wine held tight against my chest. My corner was just as I'd expected, a small cluster of quiet, nervous-looking wolves who avoided eye contact as much as I did. They took their goblets with mumbled thanks, their shoulders hunched. I saw myself in them. We were the forgotten ones. From my shadowy post, I watched the real ceremony unfold. I saw the rival Alpha, Ronan, his chest puffed out, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he greeted our Alpha. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, but his eyes were cold chips of ice. He was all swagger and teeth, a bully who had climbed to the top on the backs of others. He was everything my mother had taught me to despise. He was exactly the kind of wolf who thrived in this world. Then, a subtle shift rippled through the hall. The roar of conversation didn't lessen, but its tone changed, like a river hitting a hidden rock. A current of murmurs and low, mocking chuckles began to flow from the main entrance. I leaned out from behind my pillar, trying to see. He wasn't large or imposing. He was thin. The wolf who stepped through the grand doorway was dressed in a tunic that was more patch than cloth, its color a faded, muddy brown. His dark hair was unkempt, and he moved with a strange, quiet economy, his steps making no sound on the stone floor. He was an Omega, a lone traveler, clearly, and he had stumbled into a den of lions. The pack sensed weakness instantly, because weakness was a threat to their carefully constructed order. They needed someone to place beneath them to feel secure in their own positions. The laughter grew louder, more pointed. A young warrior intentionally bumped into him, sending the stranger stumbling. "Watch where you're going, mutt," he snarled, though it was entirely his fault. The wolf in tatters didn't respond. He simply righted himself, his gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving stillness. His eyes, they weren't fearful or submissive. They were dark and deep, and for a shocking moment, I felt like they saw everything. They saw the jealousy, the insecurity, the pathetic need for dominance that fueled the laughter around him. My heart began to pound a painful rhythm against my ribs. This was wrong. It was a raw, ugly display of power, a public stoning with words and sneers instead of rocks. It was everything I endured in quiet moments, now playing out on a grand stage for everyone to enjoy. Ronan, never one to miss a chance to perform, sauntered over. He looked the stranger up and down, a look of theatrical disgust on his face. "Lost, little dog?" he sneered, his voice carrying across the hall. With a dramatic shove, he sent the stranger sprawling into the dirt and spilled wine near the entryway. The hall erupted in a wave of cruel, vicious laughter. The sound washed over me, sickening and familiar. But as I watched the man on the ground push himself up slowly, his face an unreadable mask, I didn't see a weak Omega. In the roaring silence of his gaze, I saw not a victim. I saw a king. Chapter 4. An Act of Kindness. The laughter was a physical thing, a wave of sound that crashed over the hall and tried to drown me in its filth. It beat against my ears, sharp and cruel. In the center of it all was the wolf in tatters, pushing himself up from a puddle of mud and wine, his movements slow, deliberate. My feet were roots, locked to the cold stone floor. "Don't look. Turn away. It's not your problem." The voice in my head was a coward's whisper, the one that had kept me safe, kept me invisible for 17 years. To step forward was to paint a target on my own back. It was madness. It was suicide. But my eyes were stuck on him. He wasn't looking at the laughing crowd. He wasn't looking at the arrogant Alpha Ronin who had shoved him. His dark gaze was distant, fixed on something no one else could see, and it held an ocean of stillness. It wasn't the look of a defeated man. It was the look of a storm gathering strength far out at sea, a patient, waiting destruction. I saw my own life in that moment of public shame. I saw every sneer, every whispered insult, every time I had been made to feel small and worthless. I saw it all heaped onto this stranger, and something inside me snapped. My mother's words echoed from a place deep inside me. Kindness is its own kind of strength. My legs moved before my brain could stop them. One step, then another. The sea of wolves parted for me, their laughter sputtering into shocked, disbelieving silence. I could feel their eyes on me, hundreds of them, sharp as daggers. I ignored them. I ignored the frantic hammering of my own heart. I walked until I was standing right in front of him, the smell of wet earth and something wild, pine and ozone, filling my senses. I knelt. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. My own trembled as I looked at the mud staining his worn tunic, at the dirt on his cheek. I didn't have a cloth. I didn't have anything to offer but a few simple words. My voice came out as a whisper, small but clear in the sudden, vast silence. "Are you okay?" He finally looked at me. Really looked. The full force of his gaze was like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. His eyes weren't just dark, they were a starless midnight sky, and in their depths, something ancient and powerful stirred. There was no gratitude in them, no relief. There was only a raw, shocking intensity, a flicker of possessive fire that had no place in the eyes of a broken Omega. In that moment, kneeling in the mud in front of the most powerful wolves on the continent, I knew I hadn't just helped a stranger. I had done something irreversible. I had walked up to a sleeping dragon and whispered its name. Chapter 5. The Weight of a Gaze. Retreating to my corner felt like fleeing a battle I had just started. My hands trembled so badly I had to set the heavy tray down before I dropped it. The silence in the great hall had shattered, replaced by something worse than laughter, a furious, hissing storm of whispers, and every single one of them was about me. The Hale girl. Unbelievable arrogance. What was she thinking? I could feel their judgment like a physical weight, pressing down, trying to crush me back into the nothing I was supposed to be. Alara's glare was the sharpest of all, a promise of future pain. I tried to disappear again. I poured wine with my head bowed, my hair falling like a curtain to hide my burning face. But it was useless. I felt seen. Because from across the hall, from the dark corner where he had settled, the wolf in tatters was watching me. It wasn't a soft or grateful look. It was a heavy, unblinking stare that followed me everywhere I went. It was a tangible presence on my skin, a heat that prickled at the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back, but I knew his eyes were on me. It felt less like he was curious and more like he was studying, memorizing. It was the way a wolf watches its prey, a terrifying predatory focus that made my blood run cold and my stomach flutter with a strange, unfamiliar heat. Why was he looking at me like that? What did he want? Later, during a lull in the festivities, I slipped out into a side corridor to fetch more wine from the cellars. The sudden quiet was a relief, the air cool against my hot skin. I leaned against the stone wall for just a second, closing my eyes, trying to calm the wild bird that was beating its wings against my ribs. You shouldn't have done that. The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. My eyes flew open. He was there, standing at the other end of the corridor, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He had moved so silently I hadn't heard a thing. My heart leaped into my throat. I stammered, my words failing me. He took a step closer, and another. He wasn't hunched or timid now. He stood tall, his presence filling the narrow space between the walls. You made yourself a target, he stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, brutal fact. For me. They were being cruel, I whispered, finding a sliver of courage. They are wolves, he replied, his voice flat. Cruelty is the air they breathe. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could feel a strange warmth radiating from him. Why? It was a simple question, but it held the weight of the world. Why had I done it? Because I knew his shame. Because his silence was louder than their laughter. Because of his eyes. I couldn't say any of that. I don't know, I lied. He watched me for a long moment, his dark eyes searching my face. I felt stripped bare under his gaze, as if he could see every secret, every fear I had ever known. What is your name? He asked, his voice softer now. Lyra. He tasted the name, saying it under his breath. Lyra. The way it rolled off his tongue was different. It wasn't just a word. It felt like a brand, a claim, a whisper of a promise I couldn't understand. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned, vanishing back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared, leaving me trembling in the cold, empty hallway. Chapter 6. A Shadow's Protection. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. His single word, Lyra, echoed in my head, a constant, unnerving drumbeat. I spent the hours trying to make myself smaller than I had ever been, desperate to avoid the glares of the pack and the heavy, heated stare of the stranger I had so foolishly helped. I knew I had made a terrible mistake. His quiet intensity was 1,000 times more frightening than Ronan's loud cruelty. I had traded one kind of predator for another, and I had no idea which was worse. My escape came near the end of the ceremony, when I was finally sent to return the empty jugs to the kitchens. The corridor was dimly lit and blessedly empty. Or so I thought. There she is. The voice was sickly sweet, like honey mixed with poison. Alara. She stepped out from behind a tapestry, her 2 favorite followers flanking her like a pair of sleek, vicious hounds. Her pretty face was twisted into an ugly sneer. The little healer-blooded charity case, she purred, stepping closer. Did you really think helping that filthy stray would get you noticed? Did you think anyone would ever see you as anything other than your mother's shame? Her words were sharp little knives, each one aimed at the softest, most wounded parts of me. I backed away, my shoulder blades hitting the cold, unforgiving stone of the wall. I don't want any trouble, Alara. Oh, it's too late for that, she hissed, her eyes flashing. Her friends giggled, their faces full of mean-spirited glee. They moved to box me in. You embarrassed our pack. You embarrassed me. A nobody like you doesn't get to be the center of attention. She raised her hand, her perfectly manicured nails glinting in the torchlight, ready to strike. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the sting. It never came. There was a sudden, chilling drop in the temperature of the air. A presence moved in the shadows with a speed that wasn't natural, a blur of motion that my eyes could barely track. When I dared to look, he was there. The wolf in tatters. He stood between me and Alara, a silent, unmovable wall. He hadn't touched her, but she had frozen, her hand still in the air, her face pale with a new kind of fear. A sound rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a word. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very stones of the castle, a sound that was ancient and primal and utterly inhuman. It promised death. Alara and her friends stumbled back, their eyes wide with terror. They didn't even make a sound as they turned and fled, their fancy silks whispering as they ran for their lives. I was left alone with him, my back pressed hard against the wall, my breath caught in my throat. He turned to face me slowly. The raw, feral fury in his eyes softened as it landed on me, replaced by that same possessive fire from before, but 100 times hotter, 100 times more intense. He had saved me, but the look on his face said he wasn't my savior. He was my captor. He lifted a hand, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from my cheek, and his touch was like being struck by lightning. Chapter 7. The Weight of a Touch. His touch was a whisper of fire against my skin. My breath hitched, trapped in my throat. Just moments ago, he had been a terrifying force of nature, a silent predator who had unmade the pack's biggest bullies with nothing but a look and a sound. Now he was just a man standing too close in a dark hallway, his thumb brushing my cheek with a tenderness so profound it made my knees weak. My fear hadn't vanished. It had simply made room for something new, something dizzying and electric and utterly forbidden. What was happening to me? Did they hurt you? His voice was a low rumble, the echo of that inhuman growl still vibrating in its depths. I could only shake my head, my eyes locked on his. The darkness in them was still there, a swirling midnight storm, but for the first time, I saw something else within it, a flicker of concern, a spark of something else, something that looked a lot like hunger. He held my gaze for a heart-stopping eternity before his hand dropped away, and the warmth of his touch was replaced by a sudden, aching cold. Without another word, he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the great hall, leaving me with a ghost of his touch burning on my cheek. Later, my hands were still shaking. I was tasked with refilling wine jugs, a simple chore that now felt like an impossible challenge. My mind kept replaying the scene in the corridor, the fear in Alara's eyes, the impossible speed of his movement, the gentle shock of his touch. I was so lost in the memory that I didn't see him until I turned from the wine barrel, the heavy jug in my arms. He was just there, leaning against a stack of crates watching me. A startled gasp escaped me. The heavy jug slipped. He moved in a blur, one hand clamping around my wrist to stop my fall, the other easily steadying the jug before a single drop could spill. My arm was pinned against his chest, and I could feel the solid, unyielding muscle beneath his threadbare tunic. My pulse hammered against his grip, a wild, frantic drumbeat. He was so much stronger than he looked. It was impossible. He leaned in, his face so close I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, his breath warm against my ear. His voice was a low, intimate whisper, meant only for me. "Do you always tremble like this, Lyra?" he murmured, his tone a soft, dangerous caress. "Or only when I'm near?" The question stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a truth, an acknowledgement of the frantic, terrifying energy that sparked between us whenever we were close. He knew. He could feel it too. I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. I could only stare into his eyes and drown in the storm I saw there. After a moment that stretched for a lifetime, he released my wrist, his fingers trailing fire down my skin. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod, and then disappeared back into the loud chaos of the ceremony, leaving me breathless and shaking for an entirely new reason. Chapter 8. Gifts from a Shadow. The moon ceremony ended, but many of the guests lingered for several days, turning the pack's territory into a bustling, tense landscape of strange faces and shifting alliances. My world had been tilted on its axis. I lived in a state of constant humming awareness, a blend of deep-seated fear and a wild, thrilling curiosity. I told myself to stay away from the wolf in tatters. I told myself he was dangerous, a mystery I was better off not solving. But my heart didn't listen. And he started finding me. It wasn't in the crowded halls or busy courtyards. It was always in the quiet, forgotten places where I sought refuge. He would appear in the gardens at dusk, a silent shape among the rose bushes while I was weeding. He'd be there in the empty stables when I went to fetch fresh hay, leaning against a wooden beam as if he'd been waiting for me all along. Our first few encounters were completely silent. He wouldn't speak. He would just watch me work with that same unnerving intensity, his presence a warm weight on my skin. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I didn't. Because in his silence, I felt something I had never felt before, seen. Then came the gifts. They were never grand. He was, after all, just a poor, stray wolf. One morning, I found a perfect blood-red apple sitting on the stone ledge of a window I was washing. It was still cool, glistening with morning dew. I knew with a certainty that made my heart ache that it was from him. I ate it in secret, and it tasted sweeter than anything I had ever known. Another day, a small, iridescent blue feather was tucked into a stack of clean linens on my cart. It was impossibly soft, a tiny jewel of impossible color. I kept it. I hid it in a loose stone in the wall of my tiny room, a secret treasure. I knew I shouldn't have. Accepting these small offerings felt like signing a pact, like agreeing to a secret that tied me to him, a dangerous, unknown man. But how could I refuse? These weren't gifts of courtship, they were gifts of quiet attention. He had noticed that I loved the sweet apples from the north orchard. He had seen me watching the little bluebirds that nested in the eaves. He saw me. No one had ever given me anything that wasn't a command or a criticism. This quiet, gentle pursuit was a language I had never heard, but my soul understood every word. One evening in the stables, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, he finally spoke again. "They work you too hard," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't startle me this time. I kept my hands busy, braiding a horse's mane. "It's my job." "It's servitude," he corrected softly. He asked me about my family, about my life before whatever had made my name a disgrace. I found myself answering him, the words spilling out in a quiet torrent. I told him about my mother, about her kindness, about the whispers that had followed us our whole lives. He listened without judgment, his dark eyes holding my story as if it were something precious. I was telling my deepest secrets to a man I didn't even know the name of, and I wasn't scared. I was trusting him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a feeling so wonderful and so terrifying it almost brought me to my knees. Chapter 9. The Alpha's Gaze. That fragile trust was a tiny, flickering candle in the darkness of my life. For the first time, I didn't wait for him to find me. The next evening, I sought him out, my heart a nervous hummingbird in my chest. I found him in our spot in the gardens, sitting on a low stone wall, watching the moon rise. A comfortable silence settled between us as I sat near him, a silent acknowledgement of the strange, unspoken bond that was growing between us. For a few precious moments, I felt almost peaceful. The peace shattered like glass. "Well, look what we have here." The voice was a familiar, arrogant drawl. Ronan. He stepped out from behind a large oak tree, a cruel, knowing smirk on his handsome face. He wasn't alone. Two of his biggest warriors flanked him, their arms crossed, their expressions mirroring their alpha's contempt. My blood ran cold. He had been watching us. How long had he been watching? Ronan's icy gaze slid over me, dismissing me as something worthless before it settled on the man beside me. I was wondering where the little stray had crawled off to. He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Playing house with the disgraced healer blood, are we? It's almost pathetic enough to be cute." I flinched as if struck. The man beside me didn't move a muscle, but I felt the change in him instantly. The air around him grew heavy, thick with a sudden, violent pressure. The quiet, gentle shadow I had come to know was gone, replaced by a coiled, waiting lethality. I could feel the rage pouring off him in waves, a silent, screaming promise of violence. I was terrified, not of Ronan, but of what the man beside me was about to do. He would get himself killed trying to defend my honor. "Tell me, Mutt," Ronan continued, taking a deliberate step closer, trying to provoke a reaction. "Does she whine for you? Is she as pathetic in private as her bloodline suggests?" That was it. I saw the muscles in my companion's shoulders bunch. I felt the air crackle as he prepared to rise, to unleash the monster I knew was hiding beneath his skin. In a desperate, instinctive move, I laid my hand on his arm. It was like touching stone, his muscles bunched into tight, unyielding knots. I didn't say a word. I just squeezed, a silent, frantic plea. "Don't. Please, don't." He went utterly still. He turned his head and looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a war, a furious, primal inferno of rage fought against an iron wall of control. He was holding back an avalanche for me. He was choosing to endure this humiliation. For me. The realization shook me to my core. This was not a weak man. This was a man of terrifying power, actively choosing to hide it. Seeing no sport to be had, Ronan scoffed and turned away. "Pathetic," he muttered, before disappearing into the darkness with his cronies. The danger had passed, but the tension remained, sharp and humming between us. The man beside me slowly turned his full attention back to me, the fury in his eyes now banked to a low, dangerous glow. His voice was a quiet, chilling vow that sealed our fates together. "He will not touch you again." Chapter 10. A Vow of Violence. His words hung in the garden air, colder and sharper than the night itself. "He will not touch you again." It wasn't a comfort. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a vow of future violence, a promise of blood sworn in the pale moonlight, and it terrified me more than Ronan's threats ever could. I stared at him, at the hard, unyielding set of his jaw, and I saw the terrible truth. I was a spark, and he was a barrel of gunpowder. Staying near him wouldn't just get me hurt, it would get him killed. I took a shaky step back, pulling my arm from his grasp. The loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't understand. People like Ronan, they don't lose. You can't fight him." His dark eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dangerous in their depths. "That is where you're wrong." "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "Just stay away from me. If he sees us together again, he'll—" I couldn't finish the sentence. I couldn't picture the brutal end Ronan would bring down upon this quiet, mysterious man who had shown me more kindness than anyone in my entire life. I had to protect him, even if it meant protecting him from himself. because I finally understood that his strange gentleness was a mask for a deep, simmering rage, a rage I had just seen Ronan stoke into a deadly fire. "It's too dangerous," I finished lamely. His expression didn't soften. It hardened into something that looked like granite. "The only danger here, Lyra, is to anyone who thinks they can harm you. You don't get to make that choice." My voice rose, sharp with desperation. "This is my life, my disgrace. I'm used to it. I can handle it. I don't need you to get yourself torn apart for me." For a moment, he looked like I had struck him. A flicker of raw pain crossed his face before it was replaced by that unnerving, possessive stillness. He took a step toward me, and I took another step back. It felt like a wolf backing a fawn into a corner. "You think this is a choice?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You think I am doing this because I feel pity for you? You are mine. Mine to watch. Mine to protect. It has been that way since the first moment I saw you." His words were a cage, beautiful and terrifying. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. A part of me thrilled at his declaration, a secret, lonely part that had always dreamed of being wanted. But the rest of me was screaming in terror. This was not a sweet romance, this was an obsession, a claim, and it would lead us both to ruin. "No," I whispered again, turning my back on him. I broke into a run, fleeing the garden, fleeing his words, fleeing the impossible truth in his eyes. I didn't look back, but I could feel his gaze on me, a physical weight that promised this was not over. It was not even close to being over. Chapter 11. The Storm Within. For a full day, I was a ghost in my own life. I moved through my chores in a fog of fear, my entire being focused on one single desperate goal: avoiding him. I took different corridors. I ate my meager meals in a hidden corner of the kitchens. I kept my eyes on the floor, terrified I might catch a glimpse of a tall, silent shadow with eyes that saw too much. The entire pack was a source of danger, but he was a danger to my very soul. The memory of his words, "You are mine," was a constant burning brand on my mind. But you can't outrun a shadow. He found me in the old scriptorium, a dusty, forgotten room filled with the crumbling histories of 1,000 werewolf packs. I had come here for a moment of peace, for the quiet company of stories that were not my own. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decaying leather. It was a place of endings. I was tracing the faded spine of a book when his scent hit me first, that familiar, wild mix of pine and storm. My head snapped up. He stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit, his body silhouetted against the light of the hall. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking but firm. I would not be a fawn in a corner. Not again. "I can't," he said, and his voice was raw, laced with a frustration that bordered on agony. "You have to," I insisted, taking a step back. "What you want? It's impossible. Can't you see that? I am nothing. You are—" I trailed off. What was he? A stray? A loner? But that wasn't true, was it? He was so much more. "Whatever you are, being with me will only destroy you." "You are destroying me," he growled, and he took a step into the room. "My wolf. It claws at my insides every time you run. It demands—" That was when my rejection, my fear, and his own tortured control finally shattered. He didn't walk toward me. He moved. He crossed the room in a single, impossible blur of motion, a predator closing the distance in the blink of an eye. Before I could even scream, my back was slammed against a towering bookshelf. He didn't hit me, but the force of his presence was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. His hands were braced on the shelf on either side of my head, caging me in. And his eyes, oh gods, his eyes. They were no longer the dark, intense eyes of a man. They were glowing. A brilliant, terrifying, molten gold burned in their depths, the pupils blown wide with a feral light. The man was gone. Only the beast remained. A sound ripped from his chest, a deep, possessive snarl that vibrated through the floor, through the bookshelf, through my very bones. It was the sound of pure, untamed dominance. "Mine," he snarled, and the voice was not his. It was deeper, rougher, the sound of ancient rock and raw power. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on me with an invisible weight that made it impossible to breathe. It was his aura, his power, a living thing that was suffocating me. Then, just as quickly as the storm had broken, it passed. The inhuman glow in his eyes flickered and died, leaving behind the familiar dark gaze of the man. He looked down at me, at my terrified face, and a look of pure horror washed over his own. He stumbled back as if he'd been burned, his hands dropping to his sides. "Lyra," he choked out, my name a broken, horrified whisper. He stared at his own hands as if they were weapons, before turning and fleeing the room, leaving me to slide down the bookshelf, my body trembling with a terror so profound it had no sound. Chapter 12. The Price of Power. I didn't leave the scriptorium for an hour. I just sat on the dusty floor, wrapped in a silence that was louder than any scream, and I trembled. The image of his eyes was burned into the back of my own. That glowing golden fire, the inhuman growl that had claimed me, the suffocating weight of his power. It replayed in my mind, over and over, a nightmare that refused to end. My fear had changed. It was no longer about pack bullies or a secret forbidden attraction. This was something deeper, something older. A primal fear of the unknown. He wasn't just a strong wolf hiding his strength. He was something else. Something not entirely of this world. What was he? A demon? A monster from one of the old stories? The mystery that had once been a thrilling, dangerous puzzle was now a terrifying abyss, and I was standing on the edge. My world, which had once been the entire territory of the Silver Moon Pack, shrank to the size of my tiny servant's room. I hid. I made excuses to avoid my duties, claiming a sudden sickness. I couldn't risk seeing him. I couldn't bear to look into his eyes and see that golden fire looking back at me. From the tiny grime-covered window of my room, I saw him once. He was in the training courtyard below, a place I had never seen him go before. He wasn't training. He was standing with two other wolves, strangers with hard faces and the unmistakable bearing of warriors. They were speaking in low, urgent tones, their heads bent over a map. He wasn't the stray, the mutt, the outcast anymore. He was their center. He moved his hand across the map, pointing, commanding. He looked like a general planning a battle. He looked like a king. The sight sent a fresh wave of terror through me, because it confirmed what the monster in the library had already told me. He was a lie. Everything about him was a lie. I was so torn. My heart, the foolish, lonely traitor, ached with a sense of loss. It missed the quiet shadow who had left me apples. It missed the man who had listened to my stories in the stables. How could that gentle, attentive man be the same creature that had pinned me to the wall with its raw, terrifying power? Could a monster learn to be kind? Or was it a kind man who was cursed to carry a monster inside him? Is it possible to love something you fear so deeply? I felt more alone than ever, a tiny boat tossed between two impossible storms, a pack that despised me and a protector who terrified me. Late that night, huddled in my thin blanket, I heard two guards talking as they passed my door. "Can't believe it's the final feast tomorrow." "I know. And they say the Alpha King himself, Kale Nightbane, is going to make a formal address. Wonder what that's about." The name. Kale Nightbane. The monster from the stories. The Butcher King. A name that had always sounded like a distant thunderstorm. But tonight, for a reason I couldn't begin to understand, it sounded like the whisper of a growl in a dusty, forgotten room. Chapter 13. The strength to ask terror was a cage, and I had lived in it my entire life. But this new fear, this shivering, heart-stopping dread of the man with golden eyes, was different. It was a lock on the cage door, and I was beginning to realize that only I had the key. I spent the day huddled in my room, the name Cale Nightbane echoing in the silence. The Butcher King, a monster of legend. And yet, my mind kept showing me the face of a quiet man in the gardens, a man who had listened to my stories, a man whose wolf had bowed to my touch. The contradiction was a madness that threatened to tear me apart. Hiding was my instinct. It was the skill that had kept me alive, kept me from being broken by the endless cruelty of my pack. But hiding wouldn't work anymore. He knew my name. He had claimed me as his to protect. I couldn't run from a shadow that seemed to be everywhere at once. What was the point of hiding from the world if I was just going to be a prisoner of my own fear? I had to know. I had to face him. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, terrified drumbeat. But for the first time, it was a rhythm of action, not just anxiety. I left the prison of my small room, my hands balled into fists at my sides. I was done being a trembling fawn. If I was going to be devoured, I would at least look the monster in the eye. I searched for him. It was a terrifying reversal of our usual dance. I walked through the corridors where I had once fled, my eyes scanning the courtyards where I had hidden. I was the hunter now, and the prey was the most dangerous creature I had ever imagined. I found him on the high northern balcony, a place reserved for the Alpha and his honored guests. He stood alone, staring out at the vast, moon-drenched expanse of the forest. He wore the same ragged tunic, but there was nothing meek about the set of his shoulders. He looked like a king surveying his domain. He didn't seem surprised when I stepped out of the shadows. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes watching me approach. The power was still there, simmering just beneath his skin, a heat that warmed the chilly night air. I stopped a few feet away, my courage threatening to fail me. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and I held his gaze. My voice was a thin, trembling thread in the vast quiet, but it didn't break. "Who are you?" The question hung between us, a fragile, glittering thing. His expression was impossible to read, a mask of stone and shadow. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, pain, regret, a deep and profound loneliness, before it was gone. He opened his mouth to answer, and in that moment I knew my entire world was about to end, or begin. Chapter 14. The Feast of Lies. The sound of the ceremonial horns cut through the night, a deep, mournful cry that shattered the moment. It was the summons for the final feast, a command that could not be ignored. He closed his mouth, the unspoken answer dying on his lips. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The conflict in his eyes was a silent, raging war, but the moment was gone. Lost. He gave me a single, sharp nod, his expression once again an unreadable mask, and turned toward the hall. I had no choice but to follow. The short walk back to the great hall was the longest of my life. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with a tension so heavy I could barely breathe. I had found the courage to ask the question, and the world had conspired to deny me the answer. The feast was already in full swing, a loud, chaotic scene of forced celebration. I was immediately sent to my corner, the forgotten alcove of the outcasts, my hands moving on instinct as I poured cheap wine into pewter goblets. But my mind was far away. My gaze was fixed on him. I watched as he, the man who radiated a power that could bring a room to its knees, took a humble seat at the very edge of the hall among the other strays and loners. He picked at a piece of bread, playing the part of a meek omega so perfectly that it made my stomach churn. The lie of it all was a physical thing, a sour taste at the back of my throat. Ronan was at the Alpha's high table, his voice louder than anyone's, his laughter a sharp, ugly bark. He was in his element, a king in his court of fools. His cold eyes found me across the room, a flicker of cruel amusement in them. Then his gaze slid past me, landing on the quiet man in the corner. Ronan's smirk widened. He saw the connection between us. It was as plain as a brand on my skin. And like the bully he was, he decided to make it his entertainment for the evening. He stood up, his goblet raised high. A hush fell over the hall. "A toast," he boomed, his eyes glittering with malice. "To the strength of the Silver Moon Pack. May we always have the wisdom to welcome true warriors, and the clarity to cast out the weak strays that wander into our territory, hoping to feed on our scraps." His gaze was locked on my shadow. A wave of nervous, sycophantic laughter rippled through the crowd. My protector didn't even flinch. He just continued to stare at his plate, his stillness a silent act of defiance that seemed to infuriate Ronan even more. "And a toast," Ronan continued, his smirk turning venomous as his eyes swung back to me, "to the servants who know their place. Unlike those of disgraced blood, who foolishly believe kindness to a mutt can wash away the stain of their own pathetic heritage." This time the laughter was a roar. It crashed over me, a familiar drowning wave of shame. My eyes burned with tears I refused to let fall. But then, through the haze of my humiliation, I saw him move. The quiet man in the corner, the stray, the mutt, slowly, deliberately, rose to his feet. A profound, unnatural silence began to spread from him like a ripple in a pond, consuming the laughter until the entire vast hall was utterly still. Chapter 15. The King Unmasked. Every eye in the great hall was fixed on the lone wolf in tatters. The silence was a living thing, thick with confusion and a dawning electric tension. Ronan watched him, an arrogant, amused smirk on his face, clearly expecting this pathetic stray to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. But the stranger didn't speak. He didn't beg. He simply stood there, a figure of impossible calm in the eye of a storm he had created. He reached up with one hand, his fingers closing around the frayed collar of his miserable, mud-stained tunic. And then he shrugged. The movement was small, almost casual, but the effect was cataclysmic. The ragged disguise slid from his shoulders, pooling at his feet like a dead thing, a shed skin. Beneath it, he was transformed. He wore no crown, no jewels, only a simple, perfectly tailored tunic of black leather, marked with the silver sigil of a dire wolf. But it wasn't the clothes, it was the power. It rolled off him in a visible wave, a crushing physical force of pure, undiluted alpha dominance. It was a tidal wave of ancient authority that slammed into the room, and the very air grew thick and heavy, crackling with ozone. The torches in their sconces flared wildly, casting dancing, terrified shadows on the walls. Wolves fell. Not just the Omegas and the servants, but proud Betas and hardened warriors. Even our own Alpha, his face a mask of chalky disbelief, was forced from his high seat to his knees, his head bowed. They were not kneeling out of respect. They were kneeling because the sheer, suffocating weight of his aura gave them no other choice. A single, terrified whisper cut through the crushing silence, uttered by a visiting Alpha who was now prostrate on the floor. "Kyle Nightbane!" The Butcher King. The Alpha of Alphas. My blood turned to ice in my veins. His eyes, now glowing with a soft, controlled golden fire, swept across the room of kneeling wolves. His gaze was cold, imperious, and utterly unforgiving. He was a king, and this was his court. Then his eyes found me. I was still standing, untouched by the suffocating pressure, the only person in the entire hall left on my feet. He had shielded me. The cold fire in his gaze vanished, replaced instantly by that familiar, possessive heat that I knew so well. He completely ignored Ronan, who was kneeling with the rest of them, his face a mask of horror. Kale Nightbane's voice rang out, clear and powerful, each word a hammer blow in the vast silence. His eyes never left my face. "For days I have lived among you," he declared. "I have eaten your scraps and endured your scorn, all to find a traitor in your midst." A shudder of fear went through the kneeling crowd. And in all that time, only one person in this pack showed the honor, the compassion, and the strength of a true wolf. He raised a hand, his finger uncurling to point directly at me. That serving girl. The world tilted and spun into a dizzying, terrifying kaleidoscope. The quiet man from the garden, the golden-eyed monster from the library, the stray I had pitied, was the most feared wolf on the continent. And in a single breath, in front of everyone, he had just honored me, claimed me, and sentenced me to a life I could never have imagined. My mind didn't just break, it shattered. Chapter 16. A Crown of Terror. The king's declaration echoed in the vast, ringing silence. That serving girl. Every eye in the hall, hundreds of them, pivoted to me. I was no longer an invisible shadow. I was a specimen, pinned to a board by the word of a king, squirming under the sudden, heavy weight of their attention. The air was thick with shock, envy, and a raw, simmering hatred. This wasn't an honor. It was a death sentence. Cale Nightbane took a step toward me, his powerful aura softening as he approached. The look on his face was one of tender, triumphant expectation. He thought I would be happy. He thought I would rush to his side, the grateful little maid elevated by her prince. He had no idea. He didn't see a king who had saved me. I saw the golden-eyed monster from the library, now wearing a crown of absolute, terrifying power. I saw a cage, grander and more terrible than any I had ever known. My years of survival, of making myself small and silent, screamed at me. Power like his didn't protect, it possessed. It didn't elevate. It consumed. This was all a game, a test. I was a piece on his board, a symbol he was using to teach this pack a lesson. I wasn't a person to him. I was a tool. The thought was a shard of ice in my heart. No. The word was a faint, broken whisper, stolen by the cavernous silence. He stopped, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Lyra," he began, his voice soft. "Stay away from me." The whisper became a raw, ragged cry that tore from my throat. It was the sound of a trapped animal, filled with more terror than defiance. Before he could react, I turned and ran. I didn't just walk away. I fled. I pushed through the throng of stunned, kneeling wolves, their shocked faces a blur. I ignored the gasps, the murmurs, the sudden chaos that erupted in my wake. I just ran, my cheap slippers slapping against the cold stone, the sound echoing the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart. It was all a lie. The kindness, the secret meetings, the gentle gifts. They were all part of a calculated, cruel deception. He wasn't a shadow who saw my worth. He was a king who saw my use. I didn't stop until I reached the cramped, familiar misery of my own small room in the servants' quarters. I slammed the thin wooden door shut and threw the bolt, my back sliding down the rough wood until I was huddled on the floor. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to hold myself together as the shatters of my world rained down around me. I had rejected a king, the most powerful, ruthless king on the continent, and he knew my name. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed down the empty corridor. They were the steps of a predator, slow and deliberate. They stopped right outside my door. My heart froze. There was a long, terrible silence, and then his voice, low and strained, came through the wood. "Lyra, please, let me explain." I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears. I had nowhere left to run. Chapter 17. The Viper's Strike. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, his voice a low, pained murmur against the wood of my door. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He reasoned. He pleaded. And that was somehow worse. It was the voice of the man from the gardens, the quiet shadow. But I knew it was a lie. It was the mask the monster wore. I huddled on my cot, pulling my thin blanket around my shoulders, and I remained silent. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, leaving me alone in a silence that was even more terrifying. The next day, my sickness was real. I was sick with fear. I refused to leave my room. Kyle didn't try to speak to me again, but his presence was a constant pressure. He posted 2 of his grim-faced warriors outside my door. He said it was for my protection, the message delivered by a nervous servant girl. But it felt like I was a prisoner. Was he protecting me from the pack's jealousy, or was he keeping me from escaping him? I didn't know. His distraction was a visible thing. I watched through a crack in my door as he paced the corridors, his focus entirely consumed. He would speak to his men, his expression thunderous, before his gaze would drift back toward my room, a look of raw frustration and pain on his face. His obsession with a lowly serving girl was now a public spectacle, a crack in the armor of the invincible Alpha King. And in the shadows, someone was watching. Someone saw this crack as an opportunity. Lord Valerius, Alara's father, a man with a serpent's smile and ambition that burned like a cold fire in his eyes. He was one of the wolves who had laughed the loudest when Kale was a pathetic stray in the mud. I saw him approach the king late in the afternoon, his head bowed in a show of deep, false respect. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, his voice smooth as oil. "My pack offers its deepest apologies for our disgraceful behavior. We were blind. Allow me to offer you a drink, a toast to your great wisdom and your discerning eye." He held out a magnificent silver goblet, filled to the brim with dark, ruby-red wine. Kale, his mind clearly elsewhere, on me, hesitated for only a second. To refuse would be an insult, a diplomatic incident. With a curt nod, he took the goblet. My stomach twisted into a knot. It felt wrong. Everything about Valerius's simpering act felt like a lie, a performance even more blatant than Kale's own. From my hiding place, I watched as Kale raised the goblet to his lips. He took a long, slow drink, his eyes drifting once more toward my door. And then it happened. A strangled gasp. The beautiful silver goblet fell from his hand, clattering loudly on the stone floor. Kyle stumbled, his other hand flying to his chest. His face went pale, a sheen of sweat instantly beading on his forehead. A dark, ugly energy, like purple lightning, began to crackle over his skin. The poison was fast, unbelievably fast. Chaos erupted. Kale's guards roared, drawing their blades. But it was too late. The king, the alpha of alphas, the most powerful wolf on the continent, collapsed to his knees, a raw, agonized cry tearing from his throat. His golden eyes, wide with shock and searing pain, found my door for a final, heart-shattering second before he crashed to the floor. Chapter 18. The King's Last Breath. The door to my room flew open as if kicked by an invisible force, the bolt shattering. I didn't run from the chaos. I ran toward it. The sight in the hall was a nightmare. Kyle was on the floor, his powerful body convulsing, his face a mask of agony. His guards had already seized Lord Valerius, whose serpent smile had been replaced by a look of triumphant, hateful glee. "It is done!" Valerius shrieked as they dragged him away. "The reign of the Nightbane is over!" I pushed through the growing crowd, my feet moving on their own. The pack's healers were already there, their hands glowing with soft green light as they worked over Kale's body. But their magic was useless. It sputtered and died against the violent purple energy that pulsed from his skin. "It's no use!" the head healer cried, his face pale with terror. "It's Shadowthorn poison, a forbidden magic. It attacks the wolf's spirit directly. There is no cure." No cure. The words were a death sentence. They moved him, carrying his dying body not to a healer's room, but to the grand chamber that had been prepared for him. It was a room for a king to die in. I followed, a ghost in the wake of the tragedy, and no one stopped me. He was laid upon the bed, the fine silks a stark contrast to his fading life. The convulsions had stopped. He was just still. His breathing was a shallow, rattling sound in the cavernous silence of the room. The golden light in his eyes, The light that had terrified and thrilled me was dimming, fading to a dull, murky brown. The great Alpha King was dying, and it was my fault. The realization was a cold, suffocating wave that drowned me in an ocean of guilt. My fault. If I had just gone to him, if I hadn't been so scared, he wouldn't have been so distracted. He would have seen the viper in front of him. My foolish pride and my childish fear had created the opening the traitor needed. My mother's kindness, the one thing I had tried to hold on to, had turned into a curse. I was a curse. My disgraced blood wasn't a mark of shame. It was a sign of the destruction I brought to everyone I touched. One of his guards, his face streaked with tears, looked at me and seemed to understand something. He nodded, giving me space to approach the bed. I moved as if in a dream, my legs numb. I reached out a trembling hand and touched his. It was already growing cold. His eyes, barely open now, found mine. There was no blame in them, no anger, only a deep, vast, heartbreaking regret. He tried to form my name, his lips barely moving, but the only sound was a faint, final sigh. The last flicker of golden light in his eyes went out. All was lost. He was gone, and I had killed him. I collapsed against the bed, my forehead resting against his, and a single, hot tear of despair escaped my eye and fell upon his still chest. As it touched his skin, a strange, forgotten warmth deep within my own blood stirred to life. A faint, silver pulse that no one, not even I, could see. Chapter 19. A Silver Thaw. Grief was a cold, dead weight in my chest, a final, crushing acceptance of my own cursed nature. He was gone. The king, the shadow, the man whose touch had felt like lightning, was gone. My tear, a tiny, insignificant drop of sorrow, landed on the still expanse of his chest. I was hollowed out, a shell of a girl who had finally broken the one beautiful thing she had ever touched. All was lost. But then, something happened. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement. It was a feeling, a gentle, insistent warmth that spread from where my tear had fallen, a warmth that pushed back against the chilling finality of his death. It felt like the first thaw of spring after a long, brutal winter. I lifted my head, my eyes blurry. A light, a soft, impossible silver light was glowing on his skin, right beneath my hand. I snatched my hand back in shock, but the light didn't come from him. It came from me. I stared at my own hands, my own arms. Faint, shimmering lines of liquid silver pulsed just beneath my skin, following the map of my veins. The light was flowing from me, a quiet, steady stream, into him. And inside his chest, where my tear had landed, the violent purple energy of the poison recoiled. It shrank away from my touch like a creature of darkness from the sun. The whispers. My mother's sad, warning whispers about our blood, our heritage. They fear it because they don't understand it, she had told me once, her voice full of a sorrow I had been too young to comprehend. It is not a curse, Lyra. It is a gift. A gift, not a disgrace, not a poison. All my life, I had been taught to be ashamed of the very thing that was now fighting the incurable toxin. The pack hadn't scorned my family for being weak. They had scorned us for being powerful in a way they could never be. It wasn't a stain. It was a secret. It was a lie. Driven by a desperate, wild hope that felt like madness, I pressed my hand back against his chest. The connection was immediate, a powerful current that flowed between us. I could feel him. I could feel the tiny, flickering ember of his life force, buried deep beneath the cold, thorny vines of the poison. It was almost gone. A single spark waiting to be extinguished forever. But it was there. He was still there. Hope, fierce and blinding and agonizing, crashed through the walls of my despair, It roared through my veins alongside the strange silver power. I was not helpless. I was not a curse. I was the only thing in the entire world that stood between the man I loved and an endless night. I looked at my glowing hands, then at the dying king on the bed. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. I was a Hale, and I was his only chance. Chapter 20: The Healer's Price. The silver light pulsed around my hands, a soft, living glow in the dim, deathly quiet of the king's chamber. His guards stared, their faces masks of stunned disbelief, but they didn't move. They had seen the poison recoil. They had seen the impossible. Now they were just watching, their own hope a fragile, desperate thing. I closed my eyes, tuning out the world, and focused on the strange, new power humming in my blood. I didn't have to think about what to do. The knowledge was just there. It bloomed in my mind, ancient and absolute, a deep, instinctual understanding that had been passed down through 100 generations of forgotten healers. This was not a simple spell. This was not a chant or a prayer. This was an exchange, a trade, life for life. The shadowthorn poison was not a physical ailment. It was a spiritual one. It was a living thing made of darkness that devoured a wolf's spirit, the very essence of their being. To fight it, I couldn't use herbs or healing salves. I had to fight it with my own spirit. I had to pour my own life force, my own silver fire into him like a river, to flush out the darkness and coax the dying ember of his own spirit back to a flame. The price was terrifyingly clear. The process would drain me. It would take every ounce of my strength, every spark of my life, and feed it into him. It could leave me a mindless, empty shell. It could kill me. Was I, the girl who had spent her entire life believing she was worthless, willing to make that sacrifice? Was my small, miserable life worth trading for that of a king? The question felt foolish the moment it formed. This wasn't about worth. It wasn't about titles or crowns or who deserved to live more. It was simpler than that. It was about love. In that terrible, beautiful, clarifying moment, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I loved him. I loved the quiet, lonely stray in the gardens. I loved the fierce, terrifying protector in the corridor. And I loved the powerful, burdened king on the bed. I loved all the broken, beautiful, and monstrous pieces of him, and I would not let him die. My eyes snapped open, and the fear was gone, burned away by a fierce, brilliant resolve. I looked at the two massive Nightbane warriors who stood guard, my voice ringing with an authority that wasn't my own. "Get everyone out of the adjoining rooms," I commanded. "Now. Stand guard at the main door to this hall. Do not let anyone, no matter who they are, enter this chamber until I open that door myself. Do you understand?" The guards, wolves who would normally never take an order from a serving girl, simply stared at my glowing hands and the unwavering certainty in my eyes. They nodded once, a sharp, unified movement, and left to obey. I was alone with him, alone with our fate. I took a deep, steadying breath, placed both of my hands over his still heart, and prepared to pay the price. Chapter 21: A River of Light. I closed my eyes and let go. The world vanished in a silent, blinding explosion of silver light. It erupted from me, not like a wave, but like a dam breaking. A brilliant, roaring river of my own life force poured from my hands into his chest. The room, the world, my own body, it all disappeared. There was only the light and the immense, soul-deep connection to him. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It felt like my very spirit was being unraveled, thread by silver thread, and woven into his. I could feel the poison inside him, a cold, thorny darkness, a living thing made of spite. It fought back, lashing out at my light, trying to consume me just as it had consumed him. But I was not just a girl anymore. I was a conduit. I was a Hale healer, and this was my purpose. I pushed harder, sending more and more of myself into him. I could feel his life force, that tiny, flickering ember, and I wrapped my own energy around it, protecting it, feeding it. With every pulse of my power, the ember grew a little stronger, and I grew a little weaker. My heartbeat slowed to a crawl. My breath became a shallow memory. I was a candle burning at both ends, and I was giving all my fire to him. Outside the chamber, the light was a beacon. It poured from beneath the great wooden doors and blazed from the windows, painting the courtyard in an ethereal silver glow. The entire pack had gathered, drawn by the impossible spectacle. They stood in stunned, fearful silence, their faces upturned, watching the chamber where a king was being remade by the magic of a girl they had called a disgrace. I could feel their awe, a distant pressure against my fading consciousness. I could feel Ronan's rage, a sharp, hateful spike in the sea of emotion. He was watching his enemy being saved by a power he could never comprehend. I was fading. The darkness at the edge of my vision was closing in. I had almost nothing left to give. With one last, desperate surge, I poured the very dregs of my spirit into him, a final sacrificial offering. Inside him, the thorny cage of poison shattered like black glass. The silver light winked out, plunging the room into a sudden, profound darkness. My strength was gone. My hands slipped from his chest, and my body, now a weightless, empty shell, crumpled to the floor. At that exact moment on the bed, Cale Nightbane took a single, sharp, shuddering breath. His eyes, no longer dim, no longer dying, snapped open, blazing with a pure, brilliant, and terrifying golden light. He was back. And outside, in the stunned silence of the courtyard, Ronan, seeing the silver light vanish and sensing a moment of ultimate chaos, drew his sword. His challenge, a roar of pure, desperate fury, ripped through the night air. The final battle was about to begin. Chapter 22. A King's Fury. Darkness. A cold, quiet, floating darkness. My name was a forgotten word, my body a distant memory. I was nothing, a wisp of smoke in an endless, empty space. There was no pain, there was no fear. There was only the profound, peaceful silence of having given everything away. I was ready to drift forever. But a sound like the roar of a distant earthquake, tore through the quiet. It was a challenge, filled with hatred and fury. My peaceful void shuddered. Then, another sound, closer. It wasn't a sound for the ears. It was a feeling, a vibration that hummed through the floorboards and resonated in the very atoms of my being, a low, guttural growl that I knew in my soul. It was the sound of the storm, the sound of the beast. It was his sound. A sliver of light pierced my darkness. I was on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold stone. My eyes were barely open, the world a dizzying, unfocused blur of shadow and light. I saw two shapes, one bright with fury, the other dark with malice. Ronan and Cale. The clash of steel was a scream of sound that ripped through my head. The floor shook with the force of their bodies colliding. Heavy, brutal impacts that sent tremors through my limp form. I couldn't follow the fight. I could only feel it. I felt Cale's rage as if it were my own, a white-hot inferno of righteous fury. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a king. It was the raw, untamed rage of a male protecting his mate. He wasn't fighting for his throne. He was fighting for me. Flashes of the battle burned into my hazy vision, a blur of black leather, the glint of a golden eye, the crimson spray of blood that was not his. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of violence and the sharp, clean scent of ozone that always clung to him. He moved with a speed and grace that was inhuman, a whirlwind of controlled destruction. Ronan was a strong alpha, a warrior at his peak, but he was just a wolf fighting a hurricane. My consciousness was a flickering candle, threatening to go out at any moment. Cale. My mind formed the name, a silent prayer. Be safe. There was a final, terrible roar of defiance from Ronan, cut short by a sickening crunch of breaking bone, a choked, gurgling cry of pain. And then, silence. a profound, ringing silence that was somehow more violent than the noise it replaced. The fight was over. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy, urgent footsteps. Not the measured tread of a king, but the frantic, stumbling steps of a terrified man. A huge shadow fell over me, blocking out the blurry torchlight. I fought against the crushing weight of my own exhaustion, forcing my eyelids to flutter open one last time. He was kneeling over me. His face, splattered with another's blood, was a mask of wild, desperate terror. The invincible Alpha King, the butcher, the monster, looked at me as if his entire world was about to shatter into dust. And I was the only thing holding it together. Chapter 23. The Healer's Reward. Strong arms slid beneath me, lifting me from the cold floor as if I weighed nothing at all. The world was a spinning, nauseating blur of torchlight and the shocked, pale faces of the pack. I felt the rumble in his chest as he held me tight against him, a low, pained sound like a wolf's whimper. He wasn't walking to his throne. He wasn't addressing the crowd. He was just moving, pushing past his own guards, his only focus the fragile weight of me in his arms. He carried me out onto the high northern balcony into the clean, cold night air. The sudden chill was a shock, and it pulled me a little further from the grasping darkness. He didn't put me down. He just held me, his big body shielding me from the wind, his face buried in my hair. He was shaking. The invincible king was trembling. "Lyra." His voice was a broken whisper, a raw, ragged sound of pure fear. Please, open your eyes. Don't you dare leave me after everything. Don't you leave me now." This was not the voice of the Alpha of Alphas. It was the voice of a man on the edge of a cliff, begging the ground not to crumble beneath his feet. This was his vulnerability, a sight more rare and precious than any crown, and he was laying it bare for me, for the entire world to see. From the courtyard below, the pack watched in stunned, reverent silence. Kyle didn't seem to notice or care. He was in his own world, and it was a world that contained only me. He pulled back slightly, his golden eyes scanning my face, searching for any sign of life. "You saved me," he choked out, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him. "Your power, your beautiful, impossible power. They called it a disgrace." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Fools. It is the heart of this pack. It is the heart of me." My own heart, which had been a slow, faint flutter, gave a stronger beat. I could hear him. I could feel the desperate strength in his arms, the frantic rhythm of his heart against my cheek. With an effort that felt like lifting a mountain, I raised my hand, my fingers weakly brushing against his blood-streaked jaw. His breath hitched. He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch as if it were the only anchor in a raging sea. When he opened them again, they were swimming with unshed tears. The Butcher King, the monster of the stories, was weeping. Not for his throne, not for his victory, but for me. And in that moment, all my fear, all my feelings of worthlessness, all the lies I had ever believed about myself were washed away in the brilliant, healing light of his love. I saw him. I saw all of him. And he was beautiful. A faint smile touched my lips. He saw it, and a wave of relief so profound washed over his face that it was like watching the sun finally break through a lifetime of storm clouds. He hugged me tight, a desperate, possessive embrace that didn't feel like a cage at all. It felt like coming home. Chapter 24. The Luna's Rise. An hour later, the world had settled back onto its axis, but it was a new world entirely. I was sitting on a carved stone bench on the balcony, wrapped in Kyle's heavy fur-lined cloak. It smelled of pine and ozone and him. He sat beside me, his large hand holding mine, his thumb stroking gentle circles over my knuckles. He had not left my side for a single second. Below us, the entire Silver Moon Pack, along with the guests from the other territories, remained gathered in the courtyard. They weren't celebrating. They were waiting in a quiet, solemn vigil. Finally, Kale stood, gently pulling me to my feet. I was weak. my body still an aching echo of the power I had spent, but I leaned against him and his strength became my own. Together, we stood at the edge of the balcony, looking down at the sea of upturned faces. Cale's voice, when he spoke, was not the roar of a conqueror. It was the clear, steady voice of a true king. He told them of the traitor, Lord Valerius, and the plot against him, and then his gaze softened as it fell on me. "You scorned her for her blood," he declared, his voice ringing with a power that vibrated in my bones. "But that same blood, that so-called disgrace, is the only reason I am standing here tonight. That blood saved your king and saved you all from a war. You called her weak." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But she showed a courage greater and purer than any warrior I have ever known." He turned to face me then, taking both of my hands in his. The entire world faded away until there was only the brilliant, loving gold of his eyes. "Lyra Hale," he said, his voice now a soft, intimate rumble, meant only for me, but heard by all. "My fated mate, my savior, my queen." He turned back to the stunned and silent pack below. His voice hardened again, an iron command that would never be questioned. "You will not just respect your Luna, you will honor her." And then he did the most impossible thing of all. Kyle Nightbane, the alpha of alphas, the Nightbane King, knelt. In front of me, in front of the whole world, he went down on one knee, his head bowed. For a heartbeat, the pack was frozen in shock. Then, one by one, like a slow rolling wave, they followed. His own grim warriors were the first, then our own alpha, then Ronan's defeated men. Finally, Alara, her face streaked with tears of shame and awe, knelt in the dirt. The entire pack, the wolves who had scorned me, laughed at me, and called me worthless, knelt before me. Tears streamed down my own face, but they were not tears of sorrow. I reached down and placed my hand on Cale's shoulder. He looked up, and I helped him to his feet. I was no longer a trembling maid. I was a queen. Later, when the world had finally grown quiet, we were alone in his chamber. The fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light over us. He stood before me, his eyes full of a love so profound it made my heart ache. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "There's nothing to thank me for," I replied, my own voice soft but sure. "You saved my life, Lyra." I smiled, reaching up to cup his face. "And you, Cale, you saved mine long before that." He leaned in, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion or claiming hunger. It was a kiss of equals, of two souls who had walked through fire and found each other on the other side. It was a kiss that sealed a vow, a promise of a new dawn, not just for us, but for everyone. It was the beginning of everything.